The cruelest roads are often the ones that lead a king to the person he was always meant to find. Before sunrise, the streets of Blackstone had already filled with merchants, travelers, and polished carriages carrying nobles toward the annual harvest procession. Emily Carter kept her eyes lowered as she adjusted the worn leather strap of the wooden crate resting against her shoulder. Inside were fresh loaves of bread she had baked through the night for a bakery that barely paid enough to keep a roof over her head. Every dollar mattered. Every hour mattered. Missing a delivery meant losing work she could not afford to lose. She had learned long ago that invisible people survived longer. Stay quiet. Finish the job. Go home. That was the rule she lived by. But the rule shattered the moment a line of royal attendants blocked the narrow cobblestone street ahead. Crimson banners fluttered above polished black carriages trimmed with silver, each wheel spotless despite the dusty road. Townspeople stepped aside immediately, lowering their heads without being asked. Emily followed, clutching her crate as she searched for enough space to pass unnoticed. "You," one attendant called sharply, pointing toward her with a white-gloved hand. She stopped, confused. "Yes, you. Walk behind the last carriage." Emily blinked. "I'm sorry, sir. I only need to deliver these." "You heard the order." His tone remained calm, but final. "The procession must remain clear. You may continue after it passes." She glanced toward the bakery clock tower 2 blocks away. If she waited, the bread would arrive late. Late deliveries meant reduced pay. She swallowed the protest forming in her throat and quietly nodded. "Yes, sir." The crowd watched without speaking as Emily stepped behind the final carriage, its polished wheels rolling slowly over the uneven stones. Some whispered. Others looked away. A few children stared with innocent curiosity before their parents gently pulled them aside. Emily focused only on placing one foot after another. Humiliation could bruise pride, but pride never paid rent. Then a tiny voice interrupted the silence. "Mama." A little girl chasing a wooden toy stumbled near the moving procession. Without thinking, Emily shifted her heavy crate into one arm and reached forward just in time to steady the child before she lost her balance. The girl's frightened expression melted into relief. "Thank you," the child's mother whispered, pulling her daughter close before disappearing into the crowd. Emily smiled softly and continued walking as though nothing unusual had happened. She never noticed that several mounted guards farther ahead had witnessed everything. Nor did she notice another procession approaching from the opposite end of the avenue. Unlike the colorful noble parade, these carriages were silent. Their horses moved with impossible grace. Their polished black armor reflected the pale morning light like still water. Every conversation along the street faded. Merchants lowered their eyes. Even the city guards instinctively stepped backward. Someone nearby whispered only 3 words. The king arrived. Inside the lead carriage, Lucian Ashford sat alone, his expression unreadable as the city passed beyond the darkened glass. For centuries he had watched kingdoms rise and disappear, fortunes bloom and vanish, promises made and broken. Very little surprised the vampire king anymore. Then, through the narrow opening of the carriage window, he noticed a young woman walking behind another noble's carriage carrying a crate nearly too heavy for her slight frame. She never complained. She never begged. And after helping a frightened child, she simply resumed her place without expecting thanks. Lucian's silver eyes remained fixed on her as the distance between their 2 processions slowly disappeared. Emily Carter kept walking behind the carriage, unaware that another pair of eyes had never left her. Inside the lead carriage of the royal procession, Lucian Ashford remained perfectly still, yet every detail unfolded before him with remarkable clarity. He saw the weight of the wooden crate pressing against her tired shoulders. He noticed the faded stitching on her sleeves where careful hands had repaired the same fabric more than once. Most of all, he noticed that after helping the frightened little girl, she had quietly returned to her place without waiting for gratitude or recognition. That single choice lingered in his mind far longer than it should have. Around him, silence filled the spacious carriage until one of his advisors finally spoke. "Your Majesty, the Eastern Council is already waiting at the castle. We cannot afford another delay." Lucian did not answer immediately. His silver eyes remained fixed through the narrow opening in the window. "Who organized the procession ahead of us?" he asked at last. The advisor hesitated. "House Ashcombe, Your Majesty." They requested permission to lead the harvest procession this year. Lucian's expression did not change. Did I also authorize them to treat a citizen as part of the road? The advisor blinked in surprise. I do not understand. Lucian slowly raised one hand toward the window. Look carefully. The advisor leaned closer and finally noticed the young woman following several yards behind the decorated carriage while carrying a heavy crate alone. The noble passengers laughed among themselves, completely unaware of the quiet figure behind them. Perhaps it is a misunderstanding, the advisor offered cautiously. Perhaps, Lucian replied, though his calm voice carried enough weight to silence the conversation completely. Outside, Emily shifted the crate slightly as the morning sun climbed higher. The fresh bread inside was still warm, and she silently prayed it would reach the bakery before it lost its softness. Every passing minute meant another customer waiting. Every delay chipped away at the tiny amount she hoped to earn that day. She refused to let bitterness settle into her heart. Life had already taught her that anger was heavy, and she was carrying enough weight already. As the procession rounded the next corner, one of the decorated horses became restless after a flock of birds suddenly burst from a nearby rooftop. The driver gently calmed the animal before anything serious happened, but one elegant wooden box tied to the rear of the carriage slipped loose and landed beside the road with a dull thud. None of the nobles noticed. Their conversation continued behind polished glass. Emily stopped. She looked at the carriage moving farther away, then at the beautifully carved box resting in the dust. For a brief moment, she considered simply leaving it where it had fallen. Someone else would surely find it. Then she remembered how carefully she guarded every loaf of bread, because even small things mattered to someone. She carefully lowered her crate onto the sidewalk, lifted the surprisingly heavy box with both hands, and hurried forward despite her aching feet. Several pedestrians stepped aside to let her pass. Far ahead, Lucian watched the scene unfold without a word. He had expected frustration. He had expected resentment. Instead, the young woman who had been publicly embarrassed was now rushing to return something valuable to the very people who had ignored her existence. For the first time in many years, the ancient king found himself genuinely curious about someone he had never met. Emily hurried forward, balancing the carved wooden box carefully against her chest while trying not to disturb the bread resting inside her crate. The procession continued at an unhurried pace, and for a moment she thought she might catch up without anyone noticing. Then one of the noble attendants finally glanced over his shoulder. His expression hardened the instant he saw her approaching. He lifted one hand, as though stopping an unwelcome interruption. "Stay where you are," he called. Emily slowed immediately. "Sir, something fell from your carriage." The attendant frowned, clearly unconvinced. "Put it down." She gently shook her head. "It looks important. I only wanted to return it." Several nearby pedestrians paused to watch. Curious whispers drifted across the street as the attendant reluctantly walked toward her. Before he could reach the box, another noble leaned from the carriage window with an impatient sigh. "What is delaying us now?" The attendant bowed quickly. "This girl claims something belongs to your carriage." The noble barely looked at Emily. His attention settled on the box for only a heartbeat before his face changed. "Where did you get that?" Emily carefully extended both hands. "It slipped from the back of the carriage after the horses were startled. I did not open it." The noble accepted the box almost reluctantly, running his fingers across the polished wood before checking its silver clasp. It remained perfectly sealed. Relief crossed his face, though it disappeared just as quickly beneath practiced arrogance. "You may go," he said flatly. Emily offered a small nod. "I am glad it was not lost." She turned to retrieve her crate, expecting the matter to end there. Instead, another voice spoke from inside the carriage. "Ask her what she wants." The first noble looked surprised. "My lord, everyone wants something," the unseen passenger replied. "Money, favor, employment. Ask." The attendant repeated the question without warmth. Emily blinked in confusion. "What do I want?" "Yes." She looked down at her worn shoes before answering honestly. "Nothing, sir. It was yours." For several long seconds, no one inside the carriage responded. Finally, the window closed, and the nobles signaled for the procession to continue. The polished wheels rolled away once more. Emily simply picked up her crate and resumed walking toward the bakery. She never saw the thoughtful expression hidden behind the carriage glass. From farther down the avenue, Lucian Ashford had witnessed every word. His advisor quietly folded his hands. She refused a reward. Lucian gave the slightest nod. No, she refused a transaction. The distinction mattered. Throughout centuries of ruling, he had watched countless people perform acts of kindness only after calculating what they might receive in return. Yet the young woman carried herself differently. Her honesty appeared effortless, almost instinctive. As the two processions finally drew level with one another, Lucian spoke a single calm command to the driver. Stop. Every horse came to a smooth halt. Guards exchanged uncertain glances. Merchants froze where they stood. Even the morning breeze seemed to disappear beneath the sudden silence. Across the street, Emily looked up, startled by the unexpected stillness, unaware that for the first time in generations, the vampire king himself had chosen to step out of his carriage for an ordinary human girl. Emily stood motionless beside the sidewalk, her fingers still wrapped around the handle of the bread crate as every sound on the avenue seemed to disappear. The conversations stopped first. Then the horses became still. Even the restless pigeons scattered from the rooftops as if they sensed something the people could not. The door of the black carriage opened slowly. A polished boot touched the stone street, followed by a tall figure dressed in an impeccably tailored black coat that moved almost effortlessly in the gentle morning breeze. Lucian Ashford stepped into the sunlight with the calm confidence of someone who had never needed to announce his authority because the world recognized it before he spoke. His pale face remained unreadable, while his silver eyes quietly studied everything around him. One by one, merchants lowered their heads. City guards straightened immediately. Noble passengers climbed down from their own carriage with hurried bows that had not existed only moments before. Emily realized she should probably bow as well, but uncertainty rooted her feet in place. She had never stood this close to the Vampire King. The stories always described someone terrifying, someone impossible to approach, yet the man before her seemed remarkably composed. There was no anger in his expression, no visible pride, only quiet observation. Lucian glanced briefly toward the procession that had forced Emily to walk behind it before shifting his attention back to her. His voice was calm enough that those nearest almost leaned closer to hear it. Were you instructed to walk behind that carriage? Emily hesitated. She looked toward the nobles, then back at the king. Yes, your majesty. Did you refuse? No, sir. Why not? She answered honestly because nothing else occurred to her. I needed to finish my deliveries. I thought arguing would only delay everyone. A faint silence settled over the street once again. Lucian continued watching her, searching for bitterness that never appeared. Instead, he found only quiet exhaustion carried with remarkable dignity. One of the nobles stepped forward, forcing a courteous smile. Your Majesty, it was simply crowd management. The streets are narrow during the festival. Lucian turned his head only slightly. Crowd management. The noble nodded eagerly. Exactly, Your Majesty. There was no intention to insult anyone. Lucian looked past him toward the avenue they had just traveled. Interesting. He slowly raised one hand toward the road behind the carriage. Then why was every citizen permitted to stand beside the procession except her? No one answered. Several nobles exchanged uneasy glances while the surrounding crowd remained perfectly silent. Emily lowered her eyes, wishing the conversation would simply end so she could deliver the bread before it became cold. She had no desire to embarrass anyone, least of all people whose influence reached every corner of the city. Lucian noticed her discomfort immediately. That surprised him almost as much as her honesty. Most people seized opportunities to accuse others when protected by a powerful witness. Emily instead seemed concerned only with returning to work. His gaze drifted briefly toward the wooden crate she carried. Fresh bread still filled the air with its warm scent despite the morning chill. You have somewhere to be, he observed. Emily nodded softly. The bakery is expecting this delivery, Your Majesty. Lucian gave the smallest nod in return. Then he looked back at the nobles. His next words were quiet, but every person on the street heard them clearly. Kindness given freely deserves respect. Dignity taken without reason weakens every law that claims to protect this kingdom. No one dared interrupt. The noble who had spoken earlier lowered his head even farther, realizing that the king had not raised his voice because he had no need to. His judgment alone carried more weight than any punishment. As Lucian prepared to turn away, a glimmer beneath Emily's collar briefly caught the morning sunlight. Hidden beneath the edge of her simple dress rested an old silver pendant engraved with an unfamiliar crest. Lucian stopped instantly. His expression remained controlled, but something ancient stirred behind his silver eyes. He had seen that symbol only once before, centuries ago, in a place the world believed had vanished forever. Lucian's attention remained fixed on the silver pendant resting against Emily's collar as though the noise of the crowded avenue had vanished entirely. It was not the craftsmanship that caught his eye. Countless royal jewelers could have fashioned something equally beautiful. It was the crest engraved into the weathered silver, a rising moon embraced by 7 stars. Time had softened the edges, but not enough to erase the symbol from his memory. 300 years earlier, he had seen the same emblem carved into the gates of House Evermont, one of the oldest human families ever placed under royal protection. According to every official record, that family had disappeared long before anyone living could remember. Yet the pendant hanging around the neck of an ordinary bakery worker carried the unmistakable mark. Emily noticed the king's gaze and instinctively touched the necklace. "Is something wrong, Your Majesty?" she asked quietly. Lucian answered with a question instead. "Where did you receive that pendant?" Emily looked down at the small piece of silver before offering an apologetic smile. "I do not really know. My mother placed it around my neck when I was very young. She told me never to sell it, even if I needed the money." She hesitated before adding, "She said it belonged to someone in our family long ago." Lucian listened without interrupting. Every word deepened the mystery rather than solving it. His closest advisor stepped forward carefully. "Your Majesty, shall I have the pendant examined?" Before Lucian could answer, one of the nobles from House Ashcombe spoke with forced confidence. "Surely it is only an imitation. Street vendors copy old symbols all the time." Lucian slowly turned toward him. "Do they also copy histories that have been forgotten for centuries?" The noble immediately lowered his eyes, unable to answer. Around them, quiet murmurs spread through the crowd. Most people had never seen the vampire king question an ordinary citizen with such patience. Others wondered why an old necklace seemed more important than the harvest procession itself. Emily shifted the bread crate in her hands, clearly uncomfortable with so many strangers watching her. "Your Majesty," she said gently, "I am sorry if this has caused trouble. I truly need to finish my deliveries before the bakery opens for the lunch customers." The simple honesty in her voice almost made Lucian smile. She remained worried about warm bread while standing in the middle of a royal investigation. It was a perspective unlike any he had encountered in decades. "What bakery employs you?" he asked. "Mrs. Harper's Bakery on Willow Street." "How long have you worked there?" "Almost 4 years." "And before that?" Emily's eyes drifted briefly toward the distant church tower. "I worked wherever someone would hire me. Cleaning, serving tables, carrying deliveries. My mother became ill when I was 16. After she passed away, I simply kept working." There was no self-pity in her words. She spoke about hardship the same way someone might describe yesterday's weather. Lucian recognized that quiet resilience immediately. It was not born from comfort. It was earned through years of choosing hope over resentment. His gaze returned once more to the pendant. Ancient laws, forgotten alliances, and vanished bloodlines rarely returned without reason. If House Evermont truly had a surviving descendant, the discovery could alter more than a single life. It could awaken promises the kingdom itself had nearly forgotten. Lucian finally looked toward his captain of the guard. His voice remained calm, but every word carried unmistakable authority. "Escort Miss Emily Carter safely to Mrs. Harper's Bakery. Ensure her deliveries are completed without further delay. When her work is finished, extend a respectful invitation for her to visit the royal castle this evening. She is not to be pressured. She is to be treated as an honored guest." A stunned silence swept across the avenue as every noble present realized the ordinary young woman they had ignored only minutes earlier had just received an invitation that even the wealthiest families in Blackstone spent lifetimes hoping to earn. Emily remained frozen for several seconds after the royal procession disappeared beyond the avenue. She could still hear the final words of the vampire king echoing in her thoughts. An honored guest. The phrase felt completely unreal. She looked down at the flower dust on her sleeves and the scuffed leather shoes that had carried her across Blackstone since before sunrise. There had to be some mistake. People like her were never invited to royal castles. They delivered bread to the kitchens, left through the servants' entrance, and returned quietly to ordinary lives. Yet the captain of the royal guard stood beside her with calm patience rather than authority. "Miss Carter," he said politely, "your bread should reach the bakery while it is still warm." Emily blinked and immediately nodded. "Yes, thank you." Together, they walked toward Willow Street, while curious eyes followed from every corner. Shopkeepers paused in their doorways. Customers whispered behind raised hands. Children pointed toward the crimson cloak worn by the captain before their parents gently lowered their arms. Emily wished the attention would disappear. She had spent years trying not to stand out, and somehow a single morning had changed everything. Mrs. Harper was arranging fresh pies inside the bakery window when she noticed the royal escort approaching. Her face lost all color. She hurried outside, wiping flour from her apron. "Emily," she whispered, "what happened?" Emily offered an uncertain smile. "I honestly do not know." The captain stepped forward with a respectful bow that surprised everyone standing nearby. "Mrs. Harper, by order of His Majesty, Miss Emily Carter's deliveries are to continue without interruption. The king thanks your bakery for its service to the city." Mrs. Harper stared in complete disbelief. "The king thank my bakery?" Those were his instructions. The captain's voice remained calm. "Miss Carter is also invited to the royal castle this evening after her work is complete." The older woman slowly turned toward Emily as though seeing her for the first time. "Child, what did you do?" Emily quietly shook her head. "I only carried bread." The answer sounded almost impossible, yet it was completely true. The rest of the morning passed differently than any day before. Customers who normally hurried past greeted Emily politely. A local merchant insisted she move ahead of him in line. Even the delivery drivers who usually ignored one another tipped their hats as she crossed the market square. None of it felt comfortable. She simply continued stacking bread, cleaning shelves, and helping elderly customers carry small bags to their wagons because those were the things she understood. Shortly after noon, Mrs. Harper found Emily sweeping flour near the back room. "Take the afternoon off," she said gently. Emily looked up in surprise. "But the dinner orders will still be here tomorrow." Mrs. Harper smiled warmly. "Whatever waits for you at that castle, you should not arrive covered in flour." Emily laughed softly for the first time that day. "I do not even own clothes suitable for a royal visit." Mrs. Harper disappeared into the storage room and returned carrying a carefully wrapped garment bag. "My daughter wore this to her engagement party years ago. I think she would be happy knowing someone else could wear it." Emily accepted the gift with grateful eyes. "I cannot repay you." "You already have," Mrs. Harper replied. "Kind people always do, whether they realize it or not." As afternoon sunlight stretched across the quiet bakery floor, Emily carefully reached beneath her collar and held the old silver pendant in her hand. She traced the unfamiliar crest with her thumb exactly as her mother had done years before. "Who were you?" she whispered softly. Hundreds of yards away inside the royal castle, Lucian Ashford stood before an ancient wall covered with faded family crests. His hand rested against one weathered symbol that matched the pendant perfectly, and for the first time in centuries, the forgotten name beneath that crest no longer felt like history. It felt like destiny returning home. As the sun settled behind the distant hills, Blackstone slowly transformed beneath a sky painted with shades of gold and deep blue. Emily Carter stood alone inside the tiny room she rented above the bakery, carefully smoothing the simple navy blue dress Mrs. Harper had lent her. It fit surprisingly well, though she still felt out of place each time she looked into the small mirror hanging beside the window. She tucked a loose strand of chestnut hair behind her ear before fastening the familiar silver pendant around her neck. For a brief moment, she considered leaving it behind. Then she remembered her mother's gentle voice telling her that no matter where life carried her, the pendant should always remain close to her heart. She whispered a quiet thank you before stepping downstairs. Outside, an elegant black carriage already waited beneath the bakery sign. Unlike the lavish vehicles that had crossed the city that morning, this one carried no unnecessary decoration. Its beauty came from quiet craftsmanship rather than display. The royal captain opened the carriage door with the same respect he had shown her earlier. "Good evening, Miss Carter." Emily smiled nervously. "Good evening." The journey through Blackstone felt strangely peaceful. Gas lamps flickered to life one after another, filling the streets with warm pools of light. Families gathered outside restaurants. Musicians played gentle melodies near the town square, and children laughed while chasing one another between market stalls. Emily watched everything through the carriage window, wondering how the city could appear exactly the same while her own life suddenly felt so different. At last the carriage climbed the winding road toward Ashford Castle. Towering stone walls rose above ancient oak trees, their silver banners moving softly in the evening breeze. Emily expected soldiers shouting commands or servants rushing through enormous gates. Instead, she found remarkable calm. Lanterns illuminated quiet gardens filled with white roses. Water flowed gently through marble fountains. Even the guards greeted arriving guests with composed dignity rather than intimidation. As the carriage stopped beneath the grand entrance, Emily stepped carefully onto the polished stone courtyard. She instinctively brushed invisible dust from her borrowed dress before looking up at the castle towering above her. It seemed less like a fortress and more like a place carrying centuries of stories within its walls. A young maid approached with a warm smile. "Welcome, Miss Carter. His Majesty asked that you feel completely at ease." Emily returned the smile, though her nervousness remained impossible to hide. "I have never visited a castle before." "Then tonight will be memorable," the maid replied kindly. Inside, the entrance hall stretched farther than Emily could have imagined. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm candlelight across polished marble floors, while enormous portraits lined the walls. Yet what captured her attention most was not the wealth surrounding her. It was the silence. No one hurried. No one raised their voice. Every servant moved with quiet purpose, creating an atmosphere that felt unexpectedly comforting. Far above, from the second-floor balcony, Lucian Ashford observed her arrival without announcing himself. She paused beside every painting, admiring them with genuine curiosity rather than calculating their value. She thanked every servant who greeted her, no matter how small the gesture. She even stopped beside an elderly groundskeeper arranging fresh flowers near the entrance hall and complimented the beautiful roses before continuing forward. Lucian noticed every detail. Kindness offered upward toward a king impressed him far less than kindness offered freely toward those from whom nothing could be gained. An elderly advisor quietly approached his side. "Your Majesty, the council has already gathered in the West Chamber. They are waiting to discuss the pendant." Lucian remained silent for several moments. His eyes never left Emily as she disappeared into the softly lit corridor below. "They can wait," he answered calmly. "Some conversations deserve patience." At that very moment, Emily reached the end of the corridor where an enormous pair of carved oak doors slowly opened before her. Beyond them stood a circular chamber unlike any room she had ever seen, and at its center, resting upon a stone pedestal beneath a beam of moonlight, was another silver crest identical to the one hanging around her neck. At it, Emily stepped slowly into the circular chamber, her footsteps barely echoing across the polished stone floor. The room was unlike anything she had imagined. There were no golden thrones or displays of wealth. Instead, ancient books filled towering shelves that curved with the walls, while silver candles cast a gentle light across carefully preserved relics from centuries long past. At the center of the chamber stood the stone pedestal she had noticed from the doorway. Resting upon it was a polished silver crest nearly identical to the pendant hanging around her neck. She instinctively reached for the necklace beneath her collar, her fingers tightening around the familiar piece of silver. For a moment she simply stared, unable to explain the strange feeling growing inside her. The great council chamber opened with quiet dignity, revealing a vast circular hall illuminated by hundreds of candles whose warm light reflected across polished stone walls engraved with the history of the kingdom. 12 council members occupied carved seats surrounding a long marble table, each wearing robes embroidered with silver thread that marked centuries of service to the crown. Their conversations faded the instant Lucian Ashford entered. Their surprise deepened when Emily Carter followed only one respectful step behind him. Curious eyes immediately settled upon the young woman in the simple navy dress. She felt painfully aware that she did not belong among scholars, nobles, and ancient leaders whose lives seemed separated from hers by generations. Lucian walked calmly to the center of the chamber before turning toward the council. "This meeting concerns the House of Evermont," he announced. Soft whispers spread around the table. An elderly councilwoman slowly stood. "Your Majesty, that house has existed only in history for over 3 centuries." Lucian nodded once. "That is what we believe." He looked toward Emily with quiet reassurance. "Miss Carter, would you show them your pendant?" Emily hesitated only briefly before removing the silver pendant from around her neck and placing it gently upon the marble table. Several council members leaned forward at once. One elderly historian adjusted his spectacles before drawing a careful breath. "The engraving, every line is authentic." Another member quietly shook his head. "Impossible." A third whispered almost to himself. "No surviving record ever mentioned an heir." The oldest member of the council slowly rose from his chair. His silver hair rested neatly across his shoulders, and although age had softened his movements, his sharp blue eyes missed nothing. He approached the pendant without touching it. For several long moments, he simply studied the ancient crest before looking directly at Emily. "Child," he asked gently, "did your mother ever speak the name Evermont?" Emily softly shook her head. "No, sir. She only told me that kindness was worth protecting even when no one noticed." The elderly man's expression changed. His eyes filled with quiet recognition rather than surprise. "Those words," he whispered, "were the final oath carried by House Evermont." Silence settled across the chamber. Lucian watched every face around the table. Doubt slowly gave way to reflection. No prophecy had appeared. No miracle had taken place. Only the quiet return of a forgotten family through the character of a young woman who had never known her own history. The elderly councilman finally smiled with unmistakable warmth. "Your Majesty, perhaps history was never truly lost. Perhaps it was simply waiting for the right heart to carry it forward." Lucian turned toward Emily, who still looked overwhelmed by everything unfolding around her. "Miss Carter," he said calmly, "whether your bloodline is ultimately confirmed or not, nothing changes what brought you here today. You were not chosen because of an old pendant. You were noticed because your actions honored the values this kingdom was built upon." Emily lowered her eyes, deeply moved. "I only tried to do what my mother taught me." Lucian answered with the quiet certainty that had guided him through centuries of leadership. "Then she taught you better than many kings have been taught." Around the chamber, every council member slowly rose from their seat, not because ancient law demanded it, but because respect had been earned. Emily looked around in astonishment, unable to believe that those she had considered far above her were offering such simple dignity in return. Outside, the evening bells echoed gently across Blackstone as ordinary families finished dinner, completely unaware that within the castle walls, the future of the kingdom had shifted not through power, wealth, or conquest, but through the quiet choices of a humble young woman who never expected anyone to notice. And as Lucian looked once more toward the silver pendant resting beneath the candlelight, he realized that sometimes destiny did not arrive with thunder or glory. Sometimes it simply walked behind a carriage until someone finally chose to see it.